The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Perspectives. My name is David Schoneman and I'm your host on this program. On Perspectives, we take a look at a variety of issues that are important to folks here in Nashua and throughout the state, especially as we head into election season. There are many things that we need to be thinking about as we consider which candidates to vote for. Some of the issues that we typically think of, at least have been in the news more recently, are things like the opioid crisis, a very serious problem that we need to address. Child welfare issues with the DCYF, maybe school construction funding or roads and bridges and things like that we've heard about that I'm pleased to say that Governor Sununu and the Republican leadership in the House and Senate in the last term were able to deal with. And I will add that they dealt with these things and funded these things with significantly increased resources without having to raise taxes. In fact, they lowered taxes. So we're able to address some of these issues and keep the economy going. Very important. But there is occasionally an issue that rises to the surface that we have not heard about. And I had one such occasion at a talk a few weeks ago. I happened to attend a talk where the subject was human trafficking. And we've heard about it sort of on the periphery. We hear about it in the news periodically, maybe in the movies. But the presentation that I heard, I found to be very eye-opening. It made me realize that human trafficking is not only an issue internationally, but throughout the country and, in fact, right here in New Hampshire. And it's something that I think we need to take a look at. With me today to talk about this human trafficking issue is Donna Plourde, who is the executive director of a nonprofit called Real Life Giving, which works to diminish vulnerabilities and combat human trafficking, particularly human trafficking here in New Hampshire. Donna, welcome. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for having me, David.
So let's talk a little bit about your background, how you happened to form this nonprofit. What caused you to begin to be aware of this issue? I was quite surprised, like I said just a moment ago, I was quite surprised. Very eye-opening presentations. But what brought you to that point?
Sure. For a number of years, issues that, as they pertain to women and children, have been really important to me. And that takes lots of various ways that can present, for example, whether that's domestically or internationally, certainly. But back in 2006, my eyes were really open to the fact that human trafficking was happening on a scale that we've never seen before, really. We have more people living in slavery today than we did during this transatlantic slave trade, which is hugely eye-opening for people. Right. And not only is it happening, as you said, internationally, which most of us, if we have an idea about human trafficking, are probably familiar on that level, and that's hugely important. But also, it came to my attention through various ways that it's happening right here, not only in the United States, but certainly, as you just said, here in New Hampshire. And what happened was I started talking about the issue, trying to find out more. It absolutely gripped me, and I couldn't let it go. Reading anything that I could come across, doing some research, seeking out training at that time. And I also reconnected with a friend who's worked in various ways with domestic violence victims and also as a counselor at CareNet with individuals dealing with unexpected pregnancies. And so issues as they pertain to women and children were on her heart too. And as we talked, it just became more and more clear that we were both tired of talking about it. And so what are some things that we could do? And as we looked into what might be potential options here in New Hampshire, at that time, at least, there weren't any that we felt that any organization that we could connect with. I'm sure there were, and I know that actually now, that there were individuals certainly that had human trafficking on their radar, so to speak, and were actually doing things. But at that point, there was no organization that we knew of that we could connect to. And so that led to, in 2012, us deciding that we were going to become a nonprofit and seeking out status with the IRS and all that that entails, and receiving that status. And before then, had been doing any opportunities that we could as far as speaking engagements, simple things. Sometimes that was at church events. Sometimes that was even in someone's home where we might show a film and then just have a Q&A afterwards. And just any opportunity that came before us, we took advantage of that and just tried to raise awareness in the state, because as you can imagine, nothing really happens until people are aware that there's a problem.
That's absolutely true, and that's why it was so eye-opening to me. I was glad to get the invitation to go and to hear you and the other women speak. But it is shocking to think that there's more slavery today than there was at the height of the transatlantic slave trade, which we hear so much about, so often about. Some of the stories that I heard were truly heartbreaking. And I sat there and listened to the stories, and just as I listened to stories about the opioid crisis or child neglect, those kinds of things, just grip your heart and make you think you've got to do something. As I look towards hopefully winning the race this fall, I wonder what I want to work on in the Senate. And one of the things I like to work on is things that seem to bring so much grief to people's lives. And this human trafficking issue was certainly one that came very clear in that presentation. What does human trafficking look like in America, and particularly in New Hampshire? And is there any connection between the problems we see with human trafficking and things like the opioid crisis?
Very good questions. First of all, as far as what it looks like, human trafficking is a term that covers two basic areas, which would be forced labor or labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And a very basic definition of human trafficking is when an individual is compelled to provide labor or a service or to perform a commercial sex act through force, fraud, or coercion. And that's a basic, simplified definition that we take from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, actually. And so forced labor, that can look like agricultural work, for example. We actually had the second case that was prosecuted federally in the United States under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was a case that happened at a tree farm in Litchfield.
Oh, really?
Isn't that interesting? They think New Hampshire. So absolutely happening in the agriculture industry. Some people may have heard of, for example, the tomato farms in Florida a couple of years ago were getting quite a bit of national media. But it can also happen in, for example, hotels, any hospitality work, whether that's housekeeping, for example, restaurant work. It can be cleaning crews. When you think about it, some of the big businesses, office buildings, or say, for example, and I'm not pointing them out for any reason, but say, for example, someplace like Walmart, they're not hiring their cleaning crews. They're subcontracting, right? And so there's even less of a way to keep track of how those people may have been hired. So cleaning crews, it's not an unprecedented way by any means to see a labor trafficking situation. It can happen in nail salons. It can happen in peddling even. Some of the things that you see out on the street, there are people that have to meet certain quotas, and that can actually, it's not always, but it could be a trafficking situation. There's also domestic service, people that are either brought in from other countries or are hired here to be either nannies or housekeepers. That is not an uncommon way that people are trafficked as well. And then, of course, our group works with women that have been victims of sex trafficking. And so when we think of a commercial sex act, we're thinking of prostitution, I think, primarily comes to mind, and it absolutely can include that, whether it's in a hotel, on the street, an escort service, a residential brothel, for example. But it can also include things like exotic dancing or stripping. It can include pornography. We know a number of survivors who were filmed during their exploitation. So you never know what you're seeing for sure, if that is actually a consensual situation. And then increasingly, another form is webcams, the use of interactive exploitation that happens, that's facilitated via the internet,
I see.
where someone pays and requests certain things to be performed that way.
I see.
So that happens. What makes it commercial is that something of value is exchanged. That can be money, obviously, but it can also be for food, shelter, clothing even, or drugs for that matter. And that reminds me of your second question. There's huge overlap between the opioid crisis and what you were saying about child welfare in the circumstances, because both of those things, when you think about it, let's talk about the opioid crisis first. Sometimes we have this, I think as a culture or a society, we might make the assumption that someone might be entering prostitution because they have to support their habit. And that could be the case. But, first of all, if that is the case, what led that person to be in that position and what vulnerabilities contributed to that, right? And that addiction can be exploited, certainly. But what we find is that often people who are victims or survivors of human trafficking, that may have been introduced. Drug use may have been introduced by the trafficker, or the pimp in this case perhaps, as a means to keep someone compliant. And I've also known survivors who have said that they didn't have a substance misuse problem before their trafficking situation, but at some point did start taking drugs because of the fact that it was the only way that they were able to cope with what they were experiencing.
I see.
So New Hampshire is on the forefront in a sense that our human trafficking law, our state law here, does have a provision that recognizes the coercion that goes along with either providing or facilitating drug use or withholding as a means of coercion, which is excellent. But that all of that contributes to vulnerability, and really when it comes down to it, human trafficking is the exploitation of vulnerability. And many people who are victims have experienced situations where because of unstable home life perhaps, they've either run away, which puts them in a very, very vulnerable position, as you can imagine, or they've ended up in the foster care system, or group homes. And while I know some of them, I'm sure you do too, Dave, some wonderful foster care parents out there. Not every setting is. And the group home circumstances, they're necessary, but it can be difficult. As a matter of fact, traffickers they know where to go. They know where to recruit, and that wouldn't be uncommon. Some of the other things that we see, abuse in someone's background makes them incredibly vulnerable. Youth that are LGBTQ are vulnerable for many reasons, sometimes because they've been forced to leave home. Aging out of the foster care system. Where do you go if you don't have a strong connection perhaps to the individuals that you were living with, and you're now literally out on your own? You can see where that would also contribute to that. And there's many things that, let's just put it this way, certain populations of youth, for example, are at greater risk, some of which we just mentioned, of course. But the other thing that I try to share when I'm talking to a community group as to why they should know, one of those things is, ultimately all youth are vulnerable to some extent because traffickers will go where kids go, where youth are. And that might be the mall, that might be a coffee shop, that might be sending someone that's recruiting for them into a school. But more and more what we're seeing too is it's online. So social media and and what youth isn't involved.
Kids are always in their phones.
Right? And you don't really know who you're talking to. And if someone discloses something on social media, maybe they've just really had a whopper of a fight with their parents, or maybe they just broke up with their boyfriend or girlfriend. They're in a vulnerable position. Someone who knows what they're looking for can take advantage of that and manipulate that in their favor.
Right. So there's this vulnerability, and the question you asked before, the rhetorical question, where do you go? Kids may not see that they have any kind of choices. They don't have the maturity yet. They don't have the coping systems. They don't know what they can do. One of the things that struck me about the stories from the two women that spoke at the conference, the little talk that I went to, was how vulnerable they were and how young they were at the time. Issues with their parents, issues at home, and they run away, or even if they don't intend to, they leave the house and they end up outside of what might be any kind of protective area. One of the things I noticed in the materials that you gave me was the average age of someone entering prostitution. We know that it's somewhere in the 14 to 16-year-old range. These are kids. I mean, little kids, really, not babies, obviously, but they're not like 17 or 18 years old on the verge of adulthood. They are young. They're in their middle school years, and they don't know where to go. Now, does the agency the nonprofit, do you give them some place to go, or how does that work? What do you do specifically?
Well, for us, what we've worked in, there's certain, there's so many, as you can imagine, with any problem out there, but let's just say with human trafficking, there are many different pieces that are necessary to pull together to really serve someone who's been a victim. And you have the law enforcement part, you have social services and the various pieces that they can provide. Housing is a huge issue. Safe shelter is a huge issue. Right now, we do not have a safe house in New Hampshire. Sometimes getting out of your own locale is not a bad idea, so going to another state. But overall, all, there's still a need for safe housing, especially two things actually: long-term residential for people that might need that and need trauma services and all the things that are part of that. Job skills training, for example, a way to work through what they've experienced and then come to a place to prepare them to now re-enter society and be able to support themselves, things along those lines. We also have a real huge need for emergency temporary shelter, which would be something, say, for example, it could be as short as 48 hours, but it might be up to maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks, so that our partners could, whether that be social services or law enforcement, find a long-term solution. But where do you put someone that has to come out right now? We need to put them in a safe space so that we can look at what's available and be able to get them to that residential program if that's what is going to be the best fit for them. We don't do that, but we are connected to them. I'm a member of the New Hampshire Human Trafficking Task Force, and it's been a wonderful experience to just build those relationships because it truly does take a collaborative effort. What we do is we focus on a few different things. One is awareness and training, as I mentioned before. So that can be for community members, for people that volunteer with vulnerable populations in various ways, or it can also include professionals. Like we've done a lot of medical training. Tomorrow, as a matter of fact, I'm part of a presentation with the Emergency Nurses Association, frontliners for sure.
And this is to train them to recognize? What are some of the signs that someone might be trafficked?
It really depends on who you're talking to. So if you're a community member, that's going to be different than if you're seeing someone in a medical setting, right? And so when we do a training, we definitely tailor the indicators to what they would most likely see. As far as the general population, as it pertains to sex trafficking, say, for example, let's talk about someone who might be a high schooler or young adult, and you'll perhaps notice that they have a new group of friends. They may have possessions that they weren't able to have before, like maybe a high-end handbag, for example, new clothing, kind of a sudden appearance of high-end items, things along those lines. They may have, this is probably the most common or important thing to look out for, a new partner in their life, say, for example, a boyfriend who's most often considerably older and seems to be quite controlling. That's huge. And because what they'll do is they'll initiate a romantic relationship is a very common way to initiate what will potentially develop into a trafficking circumstance. They'll target someone who they feel has a vulnerability that they can manipulate. And then what they'll do is there's that grooming and making them believe that they really care about them, and they're giving them gifts perhaps, or there's a way I know that I can help you make money, or hey, maybe if they've seen certain things or heard the youth speak about family issues or things like that, they can be there for them. I understand you in a way that they don't. Or sometimes it can be, they seem jealous, and when you're a young woman, that might seem flattering at first, but it's a way to isolate you from people that might see what's happening.
Very manipulative.
Yeah, and very controlling. So some of those things would be some of the first things that you would look for as an individual that's just out in the community.
Sure. We have some idea of what the size, I think, of the opioid problem is. For instance, in New Hampshire, we have, I think we're the second highest on a percentage per capita basis of drug addiction or overdoses. Do we have any numbers around human trafficking in New Hampshire? Do we know anything about the size of the problem here?
That's a very good question, Dave, because I get asked that all the time. First, once it's like, well, it's not happening here is the first question.
Sure.
The second one, well, how often, or do we have that data? And yes and no. Because it's still fairly new, for example, for a long time at DCYF or in a hospital setting or whatever the agency might be, there wasn't really even a box that you could check off for human trafficking. So data wasn't being collected because they weren't sure, they didn't know that they needed to look for it. Let's put it that way. That's changing. DCYF recently revised their protocols, and they have ways that you can screen for that specifically and indicate if that's the case, and then things get reported appropriately, as do social service agencies. More and more hospitals and any healthcare providers we're reaching out to through the task force to be trained, and more protocols are in place so that data collection is being implemented in various sectors where it wasn't before. And it's also, we're seeing an uptick in, now that more people are trained, including law enforcement, for example, which is huge, and it's so encouraging. They were able to get now in the state academy here in New Hampshire for police training, they have a mandatory piece on trafficking that will be in there. So as more and more people are trained in with whatever organization or law enforcement agency that they work with, you're going to see more and more identification because of that. We are doing data collection via the task force. We have someone who handles that. She's a professor at Plymouth State, as a matter of fact. And so more and more collection will be available to us, and then that can be interpreted. But what I want to say too is, so there are some reasons that we don't have great data as of yet. However, to some degree, we're never going to be able to know. Human trafficking is incredibly lucrative. $150 billion industry worldwide.
Wow. And
when you can make that much money, and it doesn't look like the demand for these particular services are going to be going away anytime soon, it's a situation that is very high profit, but very low risk still. They stay under the radar intentionally, and it's to this point been pretty easy to do so, primarily because people are moved around a lot. And so once, for example, law enforcement might get wind of something, they may have moved on before they're able to build the case that they need to, for example.
Yeah, I was very curious during that talk actually about the size of the problem in New Hampshire, because if our opioid issue is as large, and if there's a connection between opioids and human trafficking, then does that possibly indicate that our human trafficking issue is very large? And actually, since that talk too, and some of the things that the two women who have come out of that experience were sharing, it caused me to look around. I'm driving around town. If I was at a meeting downtown or something and driving home at night and seeing something on the corner, it just made me think, is that a trafficking issue? And I saw someone who was riding around on a bicycle, a foreigner, selling encyclopedias, and I wonder, this person has a quota. I spoke with someone whose door she knocked on. Is she even being trafficked for labor? You wonder about these kinds of things. So the whole awareness issue is critical, because I think people need to know. And I've heard recently stories about an airline passenger seeing somebody who they suspected could be trafficked. And you might not think anything of it initially, or you might think, oh, none of my business. Whatever her issue is with her boyfriend, not my concern. But these could be clues or indicators that someone is in a desperate situation.
There was a number of stories recently in the media over the last few months about flight attendants that have noticed something that, because they've had training, and they started to notice that, okay, there's something wrong about this picture, and some of them have led to situations where the flight attendant communicated to the pilots, and they called it in, and there was security waiting when they got there. And as a matter of fact, this is another kudos to New Hampshire moment. Just recently in September, 2 trainings were held at the airport in Manchester for flight attendants, but also for anybody working at the airport, because you could be working in various capacities, certainly security, for example, and see things that once you're aware, oh, wait a minute, this is, maybe I'm going to give this a second look here. I'm going to pay attention. Maybe this is something that I could, a tip that I could call in, or maybe I need to intervene, depending on what they're seeing.
Good. Well, I'm glad that people are raising their awareness, because I think that what we're seeing, these few instances that we hear about, are probably the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
I want to touch on just policy stuff for just a moment. Heading into the election season here, there was an initiative in the last session to possibly begin to study or begin to consider decriminalizing prostitution. Now, that sounds like if we don't make it a crime, maybe it's going to be a little better somehow. But I did ask the question, or someone asked the question at that talk of these 2 women who came out of that. What was their opinion? Their opinion was unmistakably clear that decriminalizing prostitution is not a solution. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but I'm going to give a caveat, because I know also where they were coming from too. When we say decriminalizing in the context that you just mentioned it, usually what we're talking about is full decriminalization, which means that not only are the victims not criminalized, which actually we all agree with, we do believe that they need to be offered services and viable exit strategies. However, it also decriminalizes pimps It decriminalizes the trafficker. It
I see.
criminalizes anybody who's facilitating it. Brothel owners, for example,
Now, we don't
things
want
like
that.
that. Right.
Okay.
Because what they've seen is a huge uptick, potentially, in, for example, in Amsterdam, where it is legalized. They had to actually, a number of years ago, diminish the size of the red light district, which is famous. A lot of us have seen the pictures of the girls in the windows and things like that. They had to narrow the scope of that neighborhood because of the fact that organized crime was so involved in everything. They really couldn't control it. And in Germany, you see mega brothels and things like that. And how do you know that that individual still isn't trafficked necessarily?
They probably are. I think that'd be one of the first things I would suspect. Well, that bill, in fact, it was HB 287. It did not make it through the Senate. Senate crushed it. I think it was about 20-4, if I'm not mistaken. But it did pass in the House. And I want to make sure that folks at home understand that decriminalization is not the answer.
Well, I think it sounds like the compassionate thing to do. And like I said, I'm for what's called the Nordic model. And that's partial decriminalization. We're going to offer victim services, and we're going to help them have actual options. We've talked about the lack of choice, right? But we're not going to decriminalize anybody who's forcing someone that's facilitating it, right? Or the buyers. And in countries where they've passed that, it started in Sweden, hence it's called the Nordic model. It's spread to the other countries there. It's now passed in France, Ireland, Israel, a number of places. They have seen a decrease in prostitution rates, and I do believe that that's a safer way for.
That's the Nordic model that is passed. That sounds like
partial
something
decrim.
that I could support, because we don't want to penalize the person who's being trafficked.
Right.
They're a victim already, and if they come out of that, if their record can be expunged, I think that's something good to do. Give them a shot at a better life. Certainly, those two women that we heard speak, I think they're on to a better life.
Yes.
They're really turning a very bad experience into positive effect in our society, which is good. But the idea that we want to decriminalize all the rest of it is wrong. So I'm very glad that the Senate defeated that.
Absolutely.
I'm a little disappointed in those members in the House that supported it. I think while it may be well-intentioned, it certainly is not very well thought out, and it's the wrong way to go. Donna, we are nearly out of time. We got 30 seconds left. Anything you want to add? How can people contact you? What's your website?
Sure. Our website is reallifegiving.org. And some of the ways, we're always looking for volunteers. We do street outreach in Manchester, and we also do mentorship programs for survivors with various curriculums to help them move forward and process some of the things that they've experienced. And so if you'd like to find out more about that, we would welcome anybody that wants to contact us, reallifegiving.org, or my email is donna@reallifegiving.org.
Very good. Thank you very much for coming in, Donna.
Thank you so much, Dave. It was great to be here. I appreciate it.
And thank you, folks at home, too, for tuning in. I've been speaking today with Donna Plourde, who's the Executive Director of Real Life Giving. And we've been talking about an issue that sometimes falls through the cracks, and at least in our awareness, and that's human trafficking, which is an issue right here in New Hampshire. We have issues like opioids and DCYF funding and all these other kinds of things that we can be aware of, but human trafficking is one that we need to raise our awareness of. But thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.